Alrighty, now let's actually add the members to our list here by entering something and clicking add. So let's implement the functionality for that. Therefore, we are going to mainly work in our members activity because that's where the magic happens. But of course, as we are doing stuff with Firestore, we're storing data, we also will have to look at that class as well. All right, so first of all, let's create a new variable, a global variable here at the very top, private late init var m assigned members list, which will be an array list of members. So to be precise, of users, because a member is a user. Okay, we have user already in this class. That's good to see. Then we need to initialize this variable, and we have a function here which is the setup members list. Okay, so at this point we can just use this list here, which is passed to this class, to store it in our variable that we just created. Okay, so now it will be available throughout the whole class. And let's see where we call setup member list. We call it in here. So we go through the setup, then we show the progress dialog, then we do the Firestore class, and here we call get assigned members list detail, but inside of that we actually call the setup members list. So we pass the list and then we do that. All right. Okay, so this is what we do here. We assign it. The next step is that we want to get the member details. All right, so we set up the member list, and now it's time to get all of the member details. So let's create a new function, fun member details. So we need to get the user, and then we need to write the code to actually get the member details. Okay, and whenever we want to get something from the database, we use our Firestore class. All right, so let's create a new function here, which I'm gonna call get member details, which needs an activity of type member activity, members activity, and here it needs the email of the user, which is going to be the string. All right, so this is the member activity, and then the next step is to get that data from the database where the email is existing in the contexts. So we look at our Firestore collection called constants users dot users, and here we check where equal to constants dot email. So here it's email. Okay, so we need to create this new constant. If we look at our constants, because we are using something from the database again, right? So let's do const val email, which will be a string, which I'm gonna call email. So if we look at our users board here, or the collection users, then every user is a document, right? And inside of that user, we have the email address. So this field, email. And that is what we want to get now. So we want to check through all of the users if the email address that we just entered here, if that exists in the users. So it checks this field here. And once it has done that, we can get all of the data. And if that was successful, we will call the add-on success listener. And here we get the document with all the results. So here, document will contain all of the results here. And what we want to do with that is we want to check if the document has a size of more than 1. So, or more than 0 actually. If it is at least 1, right? So documents size is greater than 0. Because only if there are any entries in there, we want to do anything, right? So first of all, what we are going to do is we're going to create a user out of that. we're going to say document dot documents at position 0 to object with user : class .java. All right, so this is our user that we are creating inside of this document or from that document, and then we call the activity dot member details, where we then can pass in the user. Now if we look at this activity member details, here it requires a user, but so far it doesn't do anything, right? So we will still need to implement that. By the way, we need to add exclamation marks here so that the error disappears, or the warning here. Okay, and then here, what if there are no members found for the email address that the user entered? Well, first of all, we want to hide the progress dialog, and then we want to do activity dot show error snack bar, and here just the text, and you could use a warning. I think we don't have any strings prepared for that, so you could prepare a string for that. No such member found is going to be the snack that I want to display. So show error snack bar is the function that we created ourselves in the base activity. Maybe you remember it is 20 videos ago or so, but we created the snack bar function which displays an error snack bar, which has a red color and then displays the text that we pass in as the message. All right, so now you might wonder why we only add the position 0 here. Well, because the email address is going to be unique. So no one will have two, or one email address cannot have two accounts. Okay, at least by design, it shouldn't happen. Of course, we can trick the system, but users will not create or not be able to create an account with a user name or actually an email address that already exists. Okay, so that's what we don't have to take care of here, because we can just take the first entry that is found, and that will be the only entry that there is. That's why it's fine to use the approach that we do here. Okay, so that is what should happen if we were successful. Now, if we weren't successful, let's just add an on failure listener here, which is just going to say, well, first of all, it's going to hide the progress dialog, and then just going to say error while getting user details. Okay, we're just going to have a little log entry. Of course, you could also display that to the user by showing an error snack bar or something like that, but I think for now this is going to be fine. Okay, now in our member activity or members activity here, we of course still need to implement that functionality, but at the same time we have this add button that we click or can click on. You can see here to implement adding member logic. So that is exactly what we just implemented, right? So let's add that line here. So first of all, I will show the progress dialog here, which is just going to say please wait. So here this is our string that we prepared, and then I want to use Firestore class dot get member details, and here we need to pass in the activity, so this, and the email. Well, guess what, we prepared the email already, and that is the email that the user prepared or entered into the edit text email search member, so into that edit text field here. Okay, now if we look at our get member details, now it is called, right? And we also call member details, but member details is an empty function. So at this point we get the user that will be added to the members, and we can now go ahead and add that to our mboard details assigned to add and user.id. So now we add the user ID to the assigned to, which is this array list of strings. So the board is assigned to multiple users now, or at least one more user. Okay, now going back to our activity here, our members activity, we created this variable, right? This assigned members list, but we didn't add anything to it. So far we just set up the members list with the existing list, but now we also at one point need to add a new member to this list when we have actually finished this approach or finished this step. So let's go ahead and create a new function which will take care of the member assign success call. So here we get a user object, and then first of all we want to hide the progress dialog, because just before we call this function we will display the progress dialog, and then we want to make sure that the user that is passed to this function is added to the assigned members list. And then we can call our setup member list with the latest members list. Okay, so this should be called once we assigned a new member. So once we have added a new member, we click on add, but if we do that, our UI doesn't set up once again, so it's not going to be updated. But we want that to happen, right? So we want to see that we have a new member in there, and that is exactly what this setup members list does, right? So if we look at it, it sets up the whole recycler view and the adapter and everything. So this is the function that takes care of displaying things pretty much, okay? To populate all of our elements, our UI elements, with the data. That's why we need to call it, but in order to call it, we need to give it a list. And in order to give it the list that is updated, we of course need to update the list. And that is what we've done at the point when we call this member assign success, because it will only be called once the assigning of a member was successful. Now, if we look at our Firestore here we are just getting the members. So we get all of the members that we have. So we have this add-on success listener where we check whether the email exists and so forth. Okay, but at this point we don't add any new members. So we don't have any new members that are assigned to the board. So that is what we will need to create here. So assign member to board. Okay, so here we need to pass in an activity, which will be our members activity, because guess what? When we assign a member and that was successful, we of course want to call this function that we just prepared, this member assign success function. So you can see we're constantly moving back and forth between the Firestore class and the different activities, so that the activities are not dependent on Firestore or Firebase to work, but they're just dependent on the data. Because if you look at it, our members activity doesn't care where the user comes from, whether it comes from Firebase, whether it comes from a local database, whether it comes from an XML file, whatever. It just needs to get a user with the right format. And that is how our whole app is designed. All right, so now if we assign a member to a board, what we will need is the member and we need the board. Okay, we have the activity already in which we want to run the call of the function, but we also need to have the board and we also need to have the member, which is a user. Okay, so the user is of type user. And then in here we can now finally do the magic that actually adds something to the Firestore. Now you remember maybe that if you wanted to make updates, that we needed to make a hash map out of the board. Okay, so here for example, when we updated the user profile data, we needed a user hash map. Okay, so this is what we passed into the update function. And then add update task list. Here also, as you can see, we used a hash map of strings and any, and then we could update it with the hash map. And that is going to be very similar to what we are going to do in our assign member to board, because here we first of all need to have the hash map of the board pretty much. Okay, of the assigned to. Okay, so val assigned to hash map, so I'm gonna call that one, and it will be a hash map of string and any. And then we can go ahead and say at the position of constants dot assigned to, I want to assign the board dot assigned to. So the board, first we always download the board, right? So we download the board from the database. Then we add stuff to the board. For example, we add new cards or lists, or we add lists with cards, and then we also add new members, which means new users. And then at one point we need to update the board, and that's what we do here. So after we assigned a member to a board, we also want to update it in the database. So what we do is we first of all create this assigned to hash map, which is basically inside of our board. If you look at it, is this assigned to variable. And you can see here, it's just assigned to one person. So we have an entry, and then we have the value for it. So key and value. So now we can do the whole Firestore stuff, which means we can call Firestore collection, and then we want to update the constants dot boards documents that has the board ID. So board document ID, because we of course only want to update the board that we currently are working on, or that where the user has entered a new entry for the members. Okay, and then we want to update that. And if we want to update it, we need to give it a hash map. You can see it requires a map here. So one that has a string, any format. Okay, so I'm gonna assign it, or gonna pass the assigned to hash map. And then if things went right, then we will see the add-on success listener. And here I'm just gonna call activity.member assign success. And here we need to pass in the user. And that is the user that we get when we call this function. And then if things went wrong, we're just gonna add a little log entry. Okay, so here the hide progress dialog will be called, so we don't display the progress dialog, and then we will just display error while creating a board. Okay, now this function is prepared, but as you can see, it's grayed out yet. So it doesn't have the color that we need, which is this beautiful orange-yellow color, which indicates that this function is called. Now, where would it make sense to call this function? Well, in our members activity, by the way, we can see that member assigned success is now called, but here we should do that when we call the member details function. So here, after we assigned the user or added a new user to the assigned board, we can now call this assigned member to board function, which means that we of course need to use Firestore class dot assign member to board, and here we need to assign the activity. So we pass in the activity, then we need to pass in the board, and that will be our mboard details, and we need to pass in the user, which will be our user that is passed to the member details. So we are constantly passing values from one function to another, as you can see. But overall, this allows us to be independent of using the Firestore class. So if we ever should replace that, it will still work. We of course need to make sure that we have the same function names in whatever other class we're using, and that it requires the same type of data. Okay, at that point we should be able to test it, and it should run flawlessly on our application, or better said, on the emulator. Okay, so there we are, board with image. Now let's go to our members. Now let's add a member, but the thing is, in order to add a member, we first of all need to create a new member. Okay, so let's do it this way. Let's sign out. Let's sign up with a new user, and I'm gonna call this one Bart, and he will be called, or his email will be bart@gmail.com, and he will have a secure password. So now let's sign up. Okay, now we could of course sign in the user directly, so that is something that you can do yourself. It's very easy actually to just directly log in the user instead of sending him back here. So bart@gmail.com, password is secure. Let's sign in. Now let's create a new board. I'm gonna call this Daddy or Daddy's tasks, and here we can select Homer. Okay, so let's create this board. Okay, created by Bart. Very good. Now let's check this board out. Let's create a list here. So today, thinks that Dad should finish today, and then eat a donut. All right, the least healthy thing that you can eat, but now we can see that it's there. Now let's add a member. We can see in members, only Bart is there. Now let's add dennis@gmail.com, because that's the email address that I had for Homer. And you can see now Homer is here. So that works perfectly. Now let's go and do the final test. Let's log in as Homer. So let's sign out first, then sign in as Homer. And we can see Daddy's tasks are there. So there we are. We can now create tasks which are, or boards pretty much, which are linked to multiple users. So multiple users can use boards and they can inform each other about boards, or they can just add other people to the boards. Of course, they can only add people of which they know the email address. So this is something that you definitely have to take into consideration. All right. So that is it for this video. It was a longer one, but we had to add a lot of functionality and a lot of stuff that has to be done when working with Firestore, as you know. And yeah, now we have a pretty cool feature added to the app. Of course, there are still other cool features to come, so see you in the next video.